As you can tell tonight, this talk is going to be different than my previous work, both as the keyboardist for the Kingsmen, though I thought about doing the real words to Louie Louie, but I thought, no, not tonight. And a bit different also for my work, to say the least, with African trance, though on the other hand, there are similarities because music torture and African trance are both, I'm going to make the argument tonight, are intense musical experiences. Before I start the lecture, though, there is an aspect of this I cannot get across to you through the spoken word, and that is Heidegger's hyphenated terminology. So when you hear these terms, think hyphens, and this is his attempt to overcome what he calls the metaphysics of presence embedded in language. In der Weltsein, being in the world, we and the world are given together. Being there, Dasein, that's the way we are in the world. Mitsein, being with, we are always with others from the get-go. And the last term is my term, adopted from Heidegger, which is interesting, this German philosopher that really doesn't deal with music at all in his work, but that is being musical. In How Musical Is Man, John Blacking makes a distinction between music for having and music for being. To paraphrase, the former may be good craftsmanship, but the latter is art no matter where it's found, whether in a village in South Africa, where Blacking worked, or on a stage at Carnegie Hall. Art music in Blacking's sense, ritual music in mine, is a musical way of being in the world. Not every musical moment, of course, carries this ontological load. Singing a well-worn hymn Sunday morning, wishing you were somewhere else, may not be the communal religious experience for which hymnal singing was intended. Or playing the second violin part in a Beethoven's Fifth Symphony for the 100th time, all the while thinking about where you're going to eat and what you're going to eat after the concert, may not be the transcendent aesthetic experience often attributed to a musician's interior state. But there are times, dancing your disease in a Tumbuka temple in northern Malawi, or singing together before the break of a winter dawn with your brother monks in a cold monastery in Germany, or doing the same thing at a Buddhist monastery in Nepal when, as T.S. Eliot so eloquently puts it in the Four Quartets, you are the music while the music lasts. At times such as this, it's not about having a musical experience, but being one. Being musical in these intense peak experiences, however, is not always positive, life-affirming, one that, quote Blacking again, enhances human consciousness. The revelations of musical torture in the so-called global war on terror attest to the aversive power of music unleashed on human beings. Detailed descriptions of this practice, for example, death metal blasted at over 100 decibels for extended periods of time, speak to a musical way of being in the world that is indeed troubling. In what follows, I want to bring this aversive musical experience in close contact to rub against a way of being in the world that is its direct opposite, namely that of the divine horsemen of the Guinea coast of West Africa, the aboriginal home of that world religion, and it is a world religion, of the Black Atlantic called Vodou. Divine horseman is from Maya Deren's work. What could be more different than a devotee possessed by a god and the musical experience of a detainee being bombarded with ear-splitting music unpredictably day in and day out? One experience is imbued with the vital force of all traditional African music. Whatever enhances life is good. The other, the polar opposite, the very embodiment of evil according to the same moral discourse. In detention cells, musical experiences are life-diminishing, isolating, sacrificial. They are participatory, yet hold no agency. Detainees don't have a say in the matter. This lack of agency has a resonance with music ontologies of spirit possession, where those possessed claim not to be there at all. It's not they who dance, but one of the many vaudou. Instead of totally being away, as with possession, those who are caught in the jaws of detention are totally there, unable to escape sensory overload of a magnitude we can barely imagine. You are the music while the music lasts takes on a whole new meaning in this context. Only gods can live totally in musical worlds. For mortals, such musical ways of being would be sheer torture, the future frozen in a timeless past, creating an endless present. What follows is a talk of extremes, of being there and being away, of musical experience at the margins, limit experiences where selves are torn asunder and thrust into musical existences not of their own making. How do we investigate, do research on such opaque experiences? What do we do with people who, in one instance, are not there at all, are totally away, possessed by a god or spirit, and in the other are so totally there that they may never see the light of day to tell their story, though more and more of these testimonies are coming to light. In the former case, at least we can do ethnography. In the latter, participant observation is not an option. What we are left with, however, is a rapidly expanding archive told by those who were tortured and those who did the torturing, the witnessing of victim and perpetrator, and now detailed in declassified bureaucratic reports sent up the chain of command. But first and foremost, it is etched in the body subjects of all those who endured what became known as no-touch torture, what Alfred McCoy, historian at the University of Wisconsin who's done major work on this, labels as the first true innovation in that dark art in the last 300 years. Musical experience here is not some epiphenomenon that serendipitously inserted itself in this practice. Rather, it has played a major role in its implementation. Popular Western conceptions of music as entertainment or an accompaniment to other more important activities, when projected upon considerations of music as torture, relegates it to a lightness of being incapable of anchoring such extremes. However, music is cited over and over in documents and legal briefs as one of the most difficult assaults to endure. Music is front and center in the application of the triple D syndrome, dependence, debility, and dread, outlined in the CIA's official interrogation manual, KUBARK. The same decentering of music holds true for African trance, which is often relegated to ancillary phenomena. Researchers can't seem to get beyond textual exegesis in all its interpretive forms and subtleties to truly engage the power of musical experience to reveal worlds, which brings us to the rite of divine horsemen of the Guinea coast. My work in Ghana with the Ewe-speaking peoples deals with one particular iteration of the Black Atlantic shrines, namely deities from northern Ghana who came south in the 1920s, which you're seeing here. The negative effects of British colonialism were coming to their full fruition in the Volta region during this period. The economy was in shambles. Africans who had been conscripted to serve in World War I had come home with new horizons and expectations. The older Vodou didn't seem to be doing the needed work. And as so often happens in Africa, people sought the power of strangers and their gods to deal with the problems at hand. Called Brekete, after the name of the northern drum that calls these gods, which points to the centrality of music, this pantheon of northern gods quickly caught on and is now one of the largest shrines along the entire Guinea coast. As with other Vodous, these northern gods possess their devotees on a regular basis, especially when shrines gather to celebrate, and this is when the gods come to dance with their children. In the blink of an eye, a person can become seized, captured by their capacity to be taken. They are no longer aware of their bodily existence, for they are no longer themselves. It is not they who dance, but Bangli the soldier, or Wango, the god of the waters and roads, Kunde, the hunter, the father, always dressed in red, or Chria, his wife, always dressed in white. Embodiments of virtuosity, these gods are virtuosos of being there. Music in these ritual situations is not a matter of a subjective emotional experience, but rather powerful moments of making music together, the power to take people out of themselves into the in-between of being with others. Individual perspectives are overwhelmed by a ritual and musical repetition that folds back on itself, creating hollows, productive absences. From these hollows unfold the materiality of the gods. Only in such ritual situations can you not only dance with your gods, but physically touch their presence. As the arc of musical repetition bends back on itself, musical experience begins to stack, thickening time into such a density that it torques out of the hollow of its folds, into the social surround, into identity, force, power, gender, economics, the full panoply of communal life. Africans have developed techniques over millennia to mine the vital forces of musical experience for ritual purposes. Here, ritual technology creates and reveals musical worlds that are energy producers, enhancers of the force vital at the heart of traditional African religion. Hot music here is cold fusion. More energy is generated than is put in, and it is through the musical energy that African gods often find their way into the world. An intense being musical, which always already is a ritual entrainment of being with others. Thus, ritual. For the gods to be there, someone must be leaving, someone must be profoundly away, way beyond our understanding or experience of such ways of not being there. What is a being there for a deity is always already a being away for a devotee. Let me quote from one of the wife of the gods, a fishmonger who you're seeing here, who for years has been ridden by Chria. Quote, I was sitting with the other Adahau, the singing group, singing Brekete, when out of the corner of my eye I saw bright light coming from inside the shrine. I turned toward the light, and standing in the doorway of the shrine was a woman with long flowing hair dressed all in white. It was Chria. She looked at me and began to dance, twirling as she came toward me. I felt a tremendous joy and stood up to greet her, and that was the last thing I remembered until I found myself sitting in back of the shrine, exhausted. We're going to look at a video clip of someone in an initial possession. When the gods first come in, the power is so overwhelming, it seems to be painful. And what they say, it's the music that settles the possession in the head. This high-pitched scream is almost universal in possession, something Gilbert Rouget talks about. Settling in now. These bell patterns, which I'm going to come back to, are an important structural feature of the music. There are always people around to make sure he doesn't hurt himself. This woman is called the Centawa, the sentry. She's throwing white cowl and powder on him to settle the possession. That's one of the sacraments of the shrine. This is Sharia. There are many Sharias there. One God can possess many. And then the twirling dance is typical. He takes the sentry into the shrine to change him to the regalia of the gods to come out and dance. So I don't want to normalize these things. These are powerful moments of otherness to us, but a common occurrence within the society. So how do we understand musical ways of being so radically different from our own musical horizons. We may reduce them to recognizable slices of pre-existing conditions, like this, the Liszt aria from Mozart, multiple personality disorder, Freudian sublimation, Jungian archetypes, the formation of right brain personalities, Lacanian manifestations of the real, peripheral strategies of marginal peoples, the working out of colonial and post-colonial disorders, Marxist illusion, mimetic excess, and just plain good acting, to name some of the many explanations that have been offered. But we would then be masking the lived experience, here the musical experience of a God dancing the world simultaneously as the host leads it. We need to take a breath, and in that hesitation, take a look and a listen to the phenomenal surface of what people are actually doing and saying, taking seriously their own explanations. But doesn't taking such testimonies seriously risk walking down the path of that dreaded going native? After all, gods, or whatever you want to call them, are certainly not actually inhabiting human bodies. Is it not merely what people believe, and believe deeply enough that it becomes true for them? The placebo effect taken to a new level. Such unexamined presuppositions left unattended color all subsequent analysis. Spirit possession spills over and breaks through disciplinary boundaries. Divine horsemen are always on the move, refusing to stand still for inquiring minds. Reducing them to a stationary ethnographic present may assuage our discomfort with and difficulty in understanding such lived experiences, but that comfort comes at a considerable cost, doing violence to the very phenomenon we are trying to study. At best, we may be fortunate enough to catch a glimpse of this movement on the side, in our peripheral vision, hearing what is happening at the edge of silence. So how can we bring such experience-distant happenings nearer? Are there resonant experiences in our own life that can help bridge the divide? And I would say we've all had the experience of driving a car and you end up home and went, uh-oh, how did I get here? You just kind of check out into automatic pilot. And recently, in a more extreme case, Ambien-induced driving. People that have taken Ambien get out and go to grocery stores, drive their car, and have absolutely no memory of it. So there are these kinds of resonant experiences that can bring us somewhat of an understanding of how we can do things, complicated things, and not be there. A significant aspect of the experience of everyday life, something we rarely and explicitly pay attention to, is the reality that we are always in a state of flux, coming and going away and being there. There's a rhythm to it all, pointing to a cognitive flexibility in our lives that probably had strong evolutionary benefit. Yet this flexibility of being away is something we ultimately have no control over at the precise moment of its happening. We may think we can control such things. After all, for the most part, you decide when you want to go to bed or take a nap or want to escape into some internal reverie when you're listening to, I hope, not this boring lecture. However, as Merleau-Ponty reminds us, we assume the posture of someone who's sleeping before sleep ultimately visits us on its own accord. And I would make the same case for daydreaming. We may want to be away in numerous circumstances, but when we are actually displaced while embodied, it is something that is not a result of a conscious decision. Trying to make yourself think of something else to take you away from a situation usually does the exact opposite. You may prepare yourself for the experience, but the experience comes of its own free will, and just as suddenly a loud noise may startle you back into being there. This displacement itself is displaced as it withdraws. We may call sleep to visit us, but as with that dance of northern gods, the moment of its arrival is not under conscious control. Now, I'm not suggesting the possession trance is somehow an extreme form of daydreaming or some kind of sleepwalking, but there is a resonance bringing us somewhat closer to an understanding of how someone can be entranced and be there at the same time. No matter what the similarity may be, however, a gulf remains between the two that can never be bridged. For one possessed, to dance is to dream of nothing. For someone caught in the snare of being identified as an enemy combatant in the global war on terror, sleep, let alone dreaming, is only a remote possibility, people going days on end with neither, to the dark side. In her 2013 article, Towards an Acoustemology of Detention in the Global War on Terror, Suzanne Cusick states that although we now know much about the use of music in interrogation, there are three things about this practice we do not understand. How music works to destroy prisoners' subjectivities, how the sheer volume of sound might contribute to this destruction, and the issue of acoustic surveillance. I want to address the first 2 points and offer some suggestions from an ontomusicological perspective. What does listening to music mean in these coercive contexts? Is listening the appropriate term when it seems to imply some kind of volition? How does being forced to absorb musical sound rivet a kind of endless now? What are the ontological contours of such a musical assault? The use of music in enhanced interrogation techniques, the Bush administration's euphemism for torture, creates a kind of anti-ritual ritual, where musical experiences are meant to break down resistance, isolate individuals, not bring them together, and instill regression, but not in the service of the ego, but in the service of dependence, debility, and dread. But how can music be a weapon, do harm, inflict pain? More importantly, why is it we can meaningfully raise this question at this particular time? What does the practice of musical torture say about the world and our understanding of it? But how can music be torture? How can being forced to listen to music, no matter how much one might hate the particular kind of music being played, no matter how much it might offend one's cultural sensibilities, regardless of how long it goes on or how loud it might be, except for literally killing your ears, really be considered such? Fingernails pulled out, electric shocks to genitals, absolutely. Waterboarding, everyone agrees, save for a few notable exceptions. But music? How can music be torture? Is this overstating the case, undermining sanctions against real torture, which directly inflicts pain on the body, a physical reality? The neoliberal subject, after all, is ultimately responsible for his own mind, his private domain of thought. Yet more than one detainee and interrogator have cited music as one of the most devastating forms of torture. There seems to be something special about music. What a surprise for us ethnomusicologists. As one CIA agent remarked, quote, after a session of loud music, especially heavy metal, they come out totally fried, unquote. Music, of course, wasn't the only thing going on. This is a picture of a stress position called short shackling, which is used in an assemblage of torture. And what the psychologists say, the work behind this, funded by the CIA, by the way, is that when somebody directly tortures you physically, it can set up a resistance, a contest of wills between the torturer and the one tortured. But when you're put into a stress position like this, it's self-inflicted pain. Your body itself is creating it, even though you're forced to be there. And this kind of pain is truly devastating. Before you ever get there, however, you've been sleep deprived, malnourished, stripped naked, put in hypothermic conditions, extremely cold rooms, tarps laid on the floor, ice water put in, and you're put in a bath of ice water. Then you're brought in for a stress position like this for maybe 16, 17, 18 hours. If you try to move, the shackling is tied to your wrists and your ankles to an eye bolt in the floor. If you try to go back to relieve pressure, it just cuts into your flesh, both in your ankles and your wrists. You really can't move. And then comes the music. These are the threads of futility, a wound knotted tight in an assemblage of terror, often referred to by those who administered it as simply the music program. This innocuous sounding name belied a devastating attack on those unfortunate enough to have endured its purchase. There's a cluster effect at work here that is exponential. Techniques are not just strung together one after the other or one on top of the other. When combined, the assemblage takes on a life of its own, increasing its effectiveness both quantitatively and qualitatively. Yet music continually is forefronted in accounts of these experiences. It seems to have a privileged position of dread. Let me quote Ruhal Ahmed, a British national who was incarcerated in Guantanamo from 2003 through 2007. He was subjected to this technology of sensory bombardment multiple times. Once you accept that you're going to go into the interrogation room and be beaten up, it's fine. You can prepare yourself mentally. But when you're being psychologically tortured, you can't. Music makes you feel like you are going mad. You lose the plot, and it's very scary to think that you might go crazy because of all the music. The use of music, unquote, the use of music as torture at the beginning of the 21st century did not happen in a vacuum, but was part of a broader weaponization of music, which included its use in psychological operations begun decades before. Operation Wandering Soul during the Vietnam War, and this is where they would play ghost songs, and this is where Francis Ford Coppola absolutely got his idea and his famous scene from Apocalypse Now with Ride of the Valkyries. Probably much more famous is the assault on Manuel Noriega in Panama, and this was in 1989 to harass him. And then just yesterday was the anniversary of the ATF assault on the Branch Davidian compound in 1993, which for ethnomusicologists had a particular resonance because some of the music they used was Buddhist ritual music. It was also used in Iraq. Most recently, well, it's been some time now, but during the battle for Fallujah, where so much music was being played through LRAD speakers, that GIs called it Lala Fallujah. And these LRAD speakers, developed by a guy named Woody Norris, have overcome the effects of canceling waves so they can project at about 120 dB, something like a kilometer away. One of the most popular songs blasted down the narrow and twisted alleys of Fallujah through the baddest loudspeaker system any headbanger could possibly have imagined was Bodies, written and performed by the Dallas-based metal band Drowning Pool. Not only used during the Battle for Fallujah, it was a virtual theme song to the Iraq War, and this has been documented by Lisa Gilman in My Music, My War, Jonathan Pieslak in Sound Targets, etc. Played before patrols to pump up troops, during patrols to sustain adrenaline, and sometimes after to let off steam. And it was a favorite of more than one interrogator. In 2001, the official video for the song was released. Its clockwork orange persona prescient of what was to come. Now, music also has a longer history in interrogation, coming out of CIA-funded psychological research in the 1950s on, ironically, silence in the form of sensory deprivation. The other side of the coin, sensory overload, soon followed with experimentation on what they called psychic driving. One of the earliest examples I found was the interrogation of Yuri Nosenko in 1964, who was a KGB defector thought to be a double agent. Music was played 23 hours a day through headphones strapped to his ears, which, according to CIA reports, led to a complete mental breakdown. By the mid-1970s, music was incorporated in interrogation protocols taught at the School for the Americas to operatives from Latin America, who quickly spread the technique throughout the Southern Cone. But that history is going to have to wait for another paper. Whether in a detention cell or the battlefield, music was meant to be aversive, to be aggressive, a projection of power through acoustical means, which brings us finally to the title of this talk, The Music Box. In recently released declassified documents in December 20th, 2016, a little over 2 months ago, as part of a FOIA request by lawyers representing several Guantanamo prisoners in a lawsuit against the 2 psychologists who developed and in some cases personally applied the new interrogation protocols approved by the Bush administration, is a series of CIA cables describing in chilling detail the interrogation of the first documented victim of these new torture techniques post 9/11, Abu Zubaydah, a kind of patient zero. The slide on your left is a picture of him from 1995, and on the right is when he was transferred from overseas to Guantanamo Bay in 2006. It was taken as an article of faith by the intelligence community and the upper administration that he was one of Osama bin Laden's top lieutenants and therefore had knowledge about future attacks, which they needed to extract by whatever means necessary. In 2015, the New York Times reported that he actually wasn't even a member of Al-Qaeda. In 2002, when he was captured in Pakistan, Abu Zubaydah was considered the U.S.'s first high-value detainee and was quickly sent off to one of the CIA's black sites in Thailand. Shortly after arriving, the CIA sent 2 seer psychologists, John Mitchell and J. Bruce Jensen, whom they had contracted with to reverse engineer the program they had run at Fairchild Air Force Base in Spokane, to interrogate actually the medical experiment on Zubaydah. SEER training, survival, evasion, resistance, and escape, was initially designed and implemented after the Korean War as a program of inoculation, a way to prepare those most vulnerable to capture, Air Force pilots, for example, to better resist harsh interrogation by exposing them to some of the techniques they might encounter. Loud music is specifically mentioned in one of the SEER training manuals, and in the 85-page brief from the lawsuit, loud music is mentioned 16 times. That's a lot. But the program they devised for Zubaydah went way beyond what was done to soldiers at Fairchild. According to the lawsuit, they based their program design on Martin Seligman's experimental work in the 1960s on learned helplessness. Dogs were unpredictably given electric shocks with no means of avoiding them, soon gave up trying to escape even when they could. According to Seligman, who was a past president of the American Psychological Association, who was working on depression, they had been conditioned, had learned to be helpless. Mitchell and Jensen believed that sustained monopolization of perception, sensory deprivation as well as sensory overload, applied to enemy combatants would regress them to an infantile state, totally dependent upon the interrogator, compliant to his every wish, including freely giving any actionable intelligence they might have. For Abu Zubaydah, learned helplessness became futility at all levels of existence, as detailed in the CIA cables, which documented pretty much every step of the process. Reading through the some 40 pages is, I will say, beyond troubling. Bombarded for days on end with, quote, ear-splitting loud rock, unquote, stripped naked, grabbed by a collar around his neck and repeatedly slammed against a wall, he was waterboarded 83 times over a 21-day period, sometimes 3 or 4 times within an hour. After suffering these bouts of literally life and death, he was put into a small wooden box measuring about 3 feet square. I quote from one of the cables. At 1742 hours, subject was unstrapped from the board and the neck collar was removed. Pointing to the small box, the interrogator said, quote, "You know what to do," unquote. Subject got off the table, sat on the floor, and scooted into the small box. At 1743 hours prior to closing the door, the interrogator said that when they came back, they would pick up where they left off. Note, the security team opened the small box at 1857 hours in the lawsuit Salim versus Mitchell. 3 feet square from the tip of your nose to the end of an outstretched arm. Hard to imagine projecting oneself into that space. Unimaginable being there after being waterboarded 3 times in the past hour, all the while being blasted with music that is haptic in its reach. The music box, as some called it, was no toy meant to amuse, though there is more than one report that Mitchell and Jensen were enjoying the power. Abu Zubaydah's account from the court documents, not surprisingly, is quite different. Abu Zubaydah literally became an instrument of torture, specifically a musical instrument, a guitar of pain. Verging on the poetic, the imagery is striking, even more so when read in the context of a legal brief. One can only interpret these musical metaphors as a reflection of what he had gone through, how he had become the music. Which brings us once again to ask the question, why music? Which brings us to the first part of the subtitle of this lecture, Songs of Futility. Heavy metal, especially the subgenre death metal, was a favorite choice both on the battlefield and in detention cells. We were just listening to one of the most frequently used songs in sonic torture, Decide's Fuck Your God. While the title of the song was known to those who were doing the torturing, the ones on the receiving end probably didn't have a clue to what the song was about. This is true in general for lyrical content in death metal, where according to aficionados, part of its aesthetic power is not being able to understand the words. It's the timbre of the screamed and growled vocals, which is meant to invoke heaviness, dark power. Here, the satanic, which overwhelms lyrical content, the semantic message. Zubaydah, of course, did get the message, just not in the form of lyrics. The message being sent here came in the form of vocals that were indexes of aggression, something discernible across cultural boundaries. Combined with distorted guitars playing at extremely fast speeds supported by drummers playing blast beats at over 240 pulses per minute, the aggressive nature of the music, I would say, is universally unmistakable. Its effect inescapable. The perception of it, of course, was, for those involved, at polar opposites, which raises the question of what kind of stance, It's a nod to Professor Berger. Does the one tortured take to such music? Does he actually have any agency to take a stance? What intentionality is left when you are no longer able to form an intention beyond the intentionality of simply being there? Death metal, however, was not the only kind of music or sound being blasted. Thrown into the mix were such artists and groups as Eminem, Britney Spears, Christina Aguilera, Prince, Marilyn Manson, the Bee Gees, Red Hot Chili Peppers, Queen, to name just a few, and included selections specifically referred to as futility songs, such as the Meow Mix jingle and the Sesame Street theme song. But by far, the futility song that has got the most attention and reaction from people being told about this aversive musical practice is Barney the Purple Dinosaur's I Love You. The almost universal response from those in the know, that is, Western enculturated listeners, is, if I was forced to listen to Barney's theme song, I would confess to anything. Its cloying melody, based on the children's counting song, This Old Man, seems to be especially great on the sensibilities of adult Western listeners. And that is precisely why it was used. In the confines of the asymmetrical torture dyad, the one pushing the play button projected out upon the one being forced to listen his own distaste for the music, coupled with the cruel irony of the lyrics, which may be lost on the one being tortured, who may not even understand English, but most assuredly not on the one doing the torturing. This overall playlist of no-touch torture both reflects a warrior mentality, and this is a quote, heavy metal is the sound of war, and an irony of asymmetrical power that can turn a children's song into an instrument of torture.
I love you, you love me, we're best friends like friends should be, with a great I love you, you love me, we're best friends like friends should be, with a great I love you, you love me, we're best friends like friends should be, with a great I love you, you love me, we're best friends like friends should be, with a great I love you, you love me, we're best friends like friends should be, with a great
Regardless of the genre, in one sense, they were all songs of futility because there was absolutely nothing you could do about the random nature of their application. You never knew when or what was coming next. One minute it might be Metallica's Enter Sandman, and the next Barney's I Love You. Sometimes both were played at the same time. There might be 10 minutes of silence, followed by 20 hours of nonstop acoustical assault. What you were hearing was totally out of your control, the sonic embodiment of learned helplessness. You could not outstrip music's capacity to capture the ontological present. Being musical, whether life-enhancing or life-diminishing, is always reaching out into the social surround. But here the social surround thins, disappears in the darkness of being hooded, in the isolating pain of stress positions, in the sheer loudness of music that occupies every crack and crevice. Technology is heavily implicated in all of this. It was a low-craft approach to music torture enabled by the portability of music machines with their now immense storage capacity and loudspeakers that could generate the desired volume. I Love You was blasted as loud as Fuck Your God. Music became a complex weapon system, a web of significance, sonically realized, specifically designed to harm. How does the sheer dynamic force of music achieve the objectives of no-touch torture, which in Zubaydah's case, of course, also involved physical abuse? Michael Heller's work on loudness gets at some of this in his notion of listener collapse. As he hears it, listener collapse involves a double move. Quote, its loudness foregrounds sound's identity as a physical presence, while at the same time dissolving selfhood through the approach toward physical pain, unquote. Cusick hears the loudness of music as a means of disrupting and destroying subjectivity. And this is exactly where ontomusicology intervenes. I argue that, in fact, it does the exact opposite. Listener collapse nails presence, removes absence, the ability to get away from the pain, removes the capacity to go inside oneself for relief, to meander, get lost in a daydream of other places and better times, to escape. There is no opportunity here for a moody savoring of aesthetic experience or memories of comfort and ease to take a stance on the matter. It is an existential pain all the way down. This raises the whole question of whether it is just the sheer loudness of the music, the debilitating acoustical energy that does the damage. Is there something about the music itself that is a major contributing factor to its devastating effect? Which moves us to the last part of the title of this talk, and an aspect of musical torture that, for the most part, has been overlooked in the scholarship on this subject, namely temporality, a time of torture. An essential component of the no-touch torture regime is the manipulation and disruption of the temporal environment. From the moment of capture, procedures are meant to intensify, quote, shock, insecurity, and psychological stress, unquote. In a classic operation of extraction, the targets are approached in the early morning hours when they are most vulnerable, hooded, handcuffed, and shoved into a waiting Humvee to be driven in circles before arriving at a detention site. It's shock and awe at the personal level. In detention, meals are given at irregular hours, breakfast served at dinner time, then 10 minutes later, dinner is brought. Interrogations happen at random intervals. Cells emit no natural light. Sounds of the outside world are masked. Essentially, there are no markers to situate yourself within a temporal world. Music, the temporal art par excellence, as I already have stated, is unpredictable, unrelenting, which is part of the program of futility. Music in its happening, however, also can directly take over one's sense of the flow of time, can force its time to become your time, its durée, your passage. There is no escaping its omnipresence. And this omnipresence removes the past, freezes the future with nowhere to escape, not even within your own head, leaving you with nothing but the bare bulb of the present. One possible way music does this is through the phenomenon of musical entrainment, which I can only briefly touch on here. Now, I'm not implying that there's a direct causal relationship, but rather a kind of neural resonance at work. How different is the pulse of African trance and that of American torture? One is suffused with the rhythm of the crossroads, the other satanic blast beats. In heavy metal, rhythmic practice is, to quote Harry Berger, stiff, often a straight up and down series of fast beats. In death metal, blast beats, which in its classic form alternate kick drum strikes and snare drum hits, fill up rhythmic space, leaving no alternative. The beat is heavy, no transcendent melodic and harmonic material to escape the finitude of existence. So here's a transcription of blast beats from song listening to. This is the blast beat yet. This is quite different than the well-ventilated rhythmic practice of African music, which always already invites other parts to contribute to the spaces created in between the polyrhythms. I've argued elsewhere that in African rhythmic practice, especially associated with ritual, there are always at least two different kinds of beat going on, something I and others have termed the African hemiola. It is not 3 against 2 or 2 against 3 as the hemiola is often described by Western music theorists. In African music, both are simultaneously available for a musical rhythmic sophistication that has been developed over millennia. In both Remains of Ritual and Dancing Prophets, I argue that this creates a shifting phenomenal presence, a kind of acoustical illusion that is conducive to a cognitive and bodily flexibility, which I relate to the crossroads, that powerful symbol of West African multiplicity. Master drummers play around with it, dancers embody it, and ritual participants embrace it in that under-theorized form of body concussion called clapping. So here's a transcription of this. This is the timeline on top, which all the other parts relate to. This timeline is found in many different kinds of cultures and musics. And you can clap to this in different beats. It's this 12 pulse pattern. So I'm going to stomp it instead of clap it, but I'll play the top line, and these are the 4s. And 6. Three and 2. Etc. Let's take a listen. This is from, this piece of music is Bangliza. It's the warrior's music from the Brekete Shrine. And let's listen for the bell. People can clap to multiple levels of this. The temporality of musical experience, its durée, has the uncanny ability in both instances to bite into the very realm of existence, not in order to dissolve it, but to become it. In both instances, musical repetition is extreme, but with very different outcomes. For death metal, the density of time delimits possibilities. For the ride of divine horsemen, as I stated early, repetition of the timeline folds back on itself, a kind of stacking effect that thickens time into a well-ventilated musical experience full of potential. The ritual gathering at a Brekete shrine is truly a musical gathering in the ontological sense of the term. People dancing with their gods, being embraced by them through musical experience, and through such experience, reaching out into the social surround of being with others. Inside the music box, on the other hand, you are totally isolated, locked within a world where all contact is suspended, perception totally manipulated, enchained to an isolating music with no hope of release. Flesh and bone are literally vibrated to their core in this ontological hell. We human beings are supposed to be flexible, both there and away in a continual flux of give and take with each other. When this being is reduced to the narrow chinks of the cavern of the present, all hope escapes, and the gods have fled. This is a nomadic site, a desert of sound, of flashing light, of night temperatures cast in a smooth space. You, and very specifically you, have entered a ritual initiation, not of your own free will, an initiation into learned helplessness, a liminality without end. You are the sacrifice. And who are you being sacrificed to? New York Times columnist Jane Mayer, in her book, The Dark Side, cites a source who was at the black site in Thailand when Jensen and Mitchell were experimenting on Zubaydah. As her source put it, quote, "They planned to become Zubaydah's god," unquote. They held his life in their hands. As a result of waterboarding, they literally brought him back from the dead more than once. And more directly to the point here, By the time they got through with him, they transformed him into a one-eyed guitar of pain. Abu Zubaydah's body and soul turned on himself, and in the process became the perfected neoliberal subject of torture, responsible through self-inflicted pain for his own suffering. And in so doing, his soul became, to cite Foucault's reversal, the prison of the body. The news keeps catching up with this lecture. On February 2nd, it was announced that President Trump selected and the new CIA director, Mike Pompeo, appointed Gina Haspel to be the deputy director of the CIA. According to the Guardian newspaper, she was the head of the black site in Thailand during Abu Zubaydah's torture. And she was the person who sent the cable instructing that the videotapes of the interrogations be destroyed. Yes, there were videotapes because this was a medical experiment and they were keeping meticulous records. This was not a rogue operation, but a highly calibrated exercise on how to destroy someone's sense of being in the world. Though the world is saturated with music, thanks to the viral proliferation of listening devices of all kinds, shapes, and sizes, an inversion has taken place. We are statistically no longer the music absorbed into its erratic load, to use Walter Benjamin's terminology. The music is now in us, absorbed in a masturbatory denial of risk, assuaged by nostalgia. Musical experiences no longer reach out to others, but rather pulls into oneself an isolating aesthetic of pleasure that goes nowhere. In stark contrast, when those who are sick sing to heat the spirits of a Tumbuka healer, when divine horsemen ride their mounts to the music of their devotees, to cite only two examples that are going on today and that I am intimately familiar with, people are not listening to what is going on, they are there doing what is going on, making music together, growing older together. There is perhaps no other experience in human life that approaches this thick temporality. And when this gift of being with others is bestowed on those who are musically gathered, it is always already becoming ritual. Musical experience, in fact, might be the ur-ritual where the mitzain, the being with of human comportment, was forged. In Remains of Ritual, I write of one of these musical moments, one that took place in 2004, but is as vivid to me today as when it happened. I was at a fetachotro, a triennial cow sacrifice, when in the late afternoon I found myself deprived of sleep and somewhat conquered by the, quote, triumphant eruption of the plant in us, to cite Deleuze's description of inebriation. In that moment, when voices were joined together in a jubilation that only singing can bring forth, when the drums answered the call of their own rhythms, everything was turned inside out. The gods were totally there in all their grace and splendor, as only gods can be, no surplus, no remainder. The ones seized by the gods were totally away, as only those possessed can be, beyond dreams, before memory. And all the rest of us were radically in between, as only ritual participants can be, in that inverted time where musical experience dwells in religious overtones. We were all turned inside out. The inside was the outside. If music is the herald of the future that Jacques Attali claims, then its weaponization adumbrates a troubling future, one worth serious consideration, something that we ignore at our peril. Worrying signs are on the horizon. The President of the United States openly endorses torture. The euphemisms have been discarded. And new forms of technology, such as hypersonic speakers, can tailor a sonic beam to make music and words seem like they're coming from inside your head. What kind of torture would this afford when you can no longer trust that the voice in your head is your own? Perhaps we need to find new ways of doing old things. We need to once again start making music together, as is still done in significant swaths of Africa, to embrace the gift of being with others, of a musical way of being in the world, hence the significance of making music together, one of the most human things we do. Music is that rare experience that has the potential to lead us forward into new rituals of becoming, thus belonging, of being with each other, of being musical. Thank you.